Hello and good afternoon to everyone. I'm happy to welcome you back to the final session that we have here. Before introducing the session, I'd really like to draw your attention to the handsome false color image behind me. It illustrates an LSD-stimulated neuron and a control neuron, and was designed by Calvin Lee, who's a graduate student in David Olson's lab. And I want to congratulate him on a really beautiful image. In the clinical trials data session this morning, Jennifer Mitchell showed us a photograph of a lavish room in which MDMA was administered in their trial. While Matt Johnson showed a system that they use that uses headphones and a face mask to focus the participants' attention on their internal environment. These could both be considered aspects of set and settings in psychedelic trials, which is a term of art, and Ido Hartogson will address that this afternoon in more detail. Michael Mithoefer also told us how MAPS has been trying to overcome some of the biases with testing these highly perceptible psycholytic drugs. And this afternoon, Suresh Muthukumaraswamy will delve more into these complications and illustrate the depth of the challenges associated with conducting such clinical trials. Paul Applebaum will then change gear to examine the ethical issues associated with hallucinogen clinical trials, and will envisage a potential future with FDA-approved psychedelic drugs. Paul will build upon some of Celia Morgan's comments concerning abuse potential and Elias Dagwar's thoughts on how to maintain rigorous psychotherapeutic regimens in the real world of modern healthcare. Then finally, our last speaker will review some of the FDA's thoughts on how biases might be managed when evaluating psychedelic drug safety and efficacy. And Javier will also talk about REMS, or risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, which may well be needed to ensure that any successful medication in this arena can be safely used under normal healthcare conditions. These will all be brought together by Susan Leonard, who is a highly experienced industrial drug development expert. She'll bring our speakers together to discuss how and whether the gaps and challenges of psychedelic drug research can be addressed in order to seize the opportunity that which they may present. And with that, I will introduce Ido. Could you take the screen, please?
Hello, I'm Ido Hartogson from the graduate program in Science, Technology, and Society at Bar-Ilan University. My talk is dedicated to the subject of set and setting in psychedelic clinical trials. Set and setting is a concept that emerged in the 1960s, and it's considered the most central recurring concept in psychedelic research and therapy. It basically refers to the fact that psychedelic effects are deeply dependent on context. They're not constant, not uniform, irrespective of context, but rather they change in relation to context. So which context? So context includes set, and here we find psychological factors, including intention, expectation, personality, mood, and also setting, which includes environmental factors like physical surrounding, social environment, relationship between therapist and the client, and even cultural environment. How does our culture frame our understanding of the world or of the meaning of experiences with psychedelics? Set setting is a radical idea. It's radical because the idea that a person's reaction to a drug is dependent on factors like, for example, the shade of lighting in a room, the arrangement of furniture, or the identity of the people around, that idea would be curious, if not laughable, from the standpoint of conventional pharmacology. Conventionally, it is the substance that makes all the difference, not the context. But this is exactly what set and setting theory tells us. And this has some broad implications. In the 1950s and 1960s, investigators were unable to agree on a definition of psychedelic effects. On the one hand, you had researchers who argued hallucinogens induce psychosis. And on the other hand, you had researchers saying psychedelics heal the mind. Some researchers argued psychedelics disrupt cognitions, but then others were saying They actually make people more creative, more innovative. And while some reported that those who experience psychedelics never want to repeat the experience, others insisted that people who have this experience want to repeat it again and again. So all these disagreements caused some actual misunderstandings and confusion among researchers at the time. Now, actually, these apparent contradictions can easily be explained as a product of set and setting. Different groups of hallucinogenic researchers approached psychedelics with very different types of expectations, intentions, and under very different experimental conditions. And therefore, they got stunning diversity of often contradictory results ranging between the psychotomimetic on the one hand and the healing on the other, the innovative, and on the other hand, the cognitively disruptive, the delightful, but also the horrific. We can observe this double-edged quality throughout the history of hallucinogens. Aldous Huxley wrote a book about the psychedelic experience, and that's titled Heaven and Hell. Both heaven and hell can be found in the psychedelic experience because the most distinctive quality of psychedelics is that they intensify experience. Psychedelics have been called amplifiers and magnifiers of the mind. They intensify experiences to make people more susceptible to sensory and cognitive impressions. This can result in experiences that are beatific and healing, but also alternatively, experiences that are horrific and scarring. And what this means is that one must pay a lot of attention to the context. Context is vital because it determines the character of the experience for good or for worse. Now, as I've said, the idea of sense setting has been around since the 1960s. And over the past years, with the resurgence of psychedelic research, we've had more and more studies that point to the many ways that set and setting shape experiences with psychedelics. These studies show, for example, that therapeutic intention and supportive social environment reduce the likelihood for challenging experiences and improve therapeutic prospects. They also show that the choice of music and the arrangement of physical space alter responses to psychedelics, again, changing therapeutic outcomes. Now, all of these results point to the crucial importance of non-pharmacological factors. These factors are so crucial that some studies even showed that by just manipulating non-pharmacological factors without using any drugs, one can produce psychedelic-like altered states of consciousness, which correlates perfectly with everything we know about placebo response. So how do we utilize these insights to optimize the benefits and minimize the risks of psychedelic therapy? When psychedelic research reignited in the 2000s, investigators took the subject of set and setting very seriously. Current research with psychedelics places a premium on creating safe and supportive set and setting with the intention of providing the best container for therapeutic outcomes. And this intention to set and setting is evident in the care given to details like room arrangement, lighting, privacy, musical selection, and maybe most importantly, the therapeutical framework itself, building a trusting relationship between therapist and client, doing preparatory pre-session work and integrative post-session work. All of this is geared towards creating an emotionally secure environment that allows clients to feel secure, embark on empowering healing journeys, and later integrate them into their lives. These principles should play a central role in regulating how psychedelics are prescribed. They can be viewed under the framework of risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, a concept that's already established in the context of drug regulation. And this is all well, but it also raises some fundamental questions regarding the future of psychedelic therapy. A quandary emerges out of the fact that some of the measures in current psychedelic clinical trials, like securing 2 therapists in a dedicated room for a period of 8 hours, these may be daunting in cost. And thereby, this is reducing the affordability and availability of psychedelic medicine once it's approved. The question is therefore raised, can psychedelic therapy work without such elaborate measures? And alternatively, one may ask if psychedelic therapy could work relying on set and setting only, without use of any drugs. And the answer to both these questions may be yes, but. Firstly, to the first question. Yes, psychedelics unquestionably are able to produce results, therapeutic results, even without the type of set and setting employed in today's clinical trials. Individuals have been having deeply healing experiences with psychedelics since millennia in many different types of contexts, in traditional psychedelic rituals, in natural environments, even in electronic dance festivals. The drugs can achieve impressive results even without the costly type of set and setting that's currently employed to safeguard their effects. But giving up on these safeguards can run the risk of increasing adverse effects. And the question then becomes, what parts of the current apparatus may be sacrificed without sacrificing too much in terms of safety and efficacy? And I'll get back to this question in a moment, but I first want to answer the second question I raised. Could the effects of psychedelic therapy be achieved relying on set and setting only, giving up on the drug? And here too, the answer is yes, but. We know how strong placebo effects are, not only in the case of psychedelic medicine. Ritual, intention, expectation, all of these things are in themselves able to produce dramatic results. Yet, we would be fooling ourselves if we were to believe that we can give up on the drugs altogether and rely on these non-pharmacological aspects only. Studies show that it is the combination of drug pharmacology and non-pharmacological factors that produce the impressive experimental results exhibited by psychedelic research. Psychedelics are valuable precisely because they are able to harness non-pharmacological factors and amplify them in profoundly meaningful ways that produce transformative results. So, where does it leave us? Back in the 1950s, anthropologist Anthony Wallace suggested the idea of cultural controls. The idea is that in the same way that clinical trials use experimental controls to highlight the effects of specific drugs, Wallace argued we might be able to control for the non-pharmacological factors, finding out which ones are crucial and which ones are secondary. This proposal challenges established conventions of clinical research, but it might be crucial if we truly wish to decipher the factors determining the success of psychedelic therapy. And this project is already underway in the growing number of studies controlling for such non-pharmacological factors. The use of risk evaluation and mitigation strategies will be essential in the implementation of psychedelic therapy. It'll be incredibly dangerous to do away with the entire body of knowledge we have amassed on good practices in psychedelic work. Indiscriminately trying to cut costs may lead to a race to the bottom in terms of care standards, clinical results, and produce actual harms. And at the same time, moving away from the clinical trial phase and into widespread adoption of these drugs will also mean ongoing reassessment of the non-pharmacological context. That does not need and should not happen at once. We may opt to control for specifically significant factors in order to discover which ones are the most crucial, most for cost-effective psychedelic therapy, and to gain a better idea of what it is that we gain or lose by including or excluding specific elements from the therapeutic framework. But it is important to note this process can prove tricky. Because set and setting is dependent on context, we may discover that our methods and measures work differently in different populations and cultural controls. Medical anthropologist Nicholas Langlitz suggests that psychedelic therapy will encounter new challenges once it moves beyond the cultural milieu where it was developed and into new population segments. These are complex questions, and we'll discover the answers to them as we go along. Cultural controls are one direction to follow, challenging, complex, but meaningful, and ultimately crucial to gaining a true understanding of the relative weight of the components of psychedelic therapy. Another direction which should be mentioned in any discussion regarding cost reduction and benefit maximization is the communal option. Psychedelics have been used communally for millennia and continue to be used communally in diverse contexts, including traditional rituals and modern retreats. Studies show that adverse effects are extremely rare in many of these settings. Well-organized communal settings provide high-quality support and containment for therapeutic experiences with psychedelics. And finally, when we speak about set and setting, we need to keep in mind that the set and setting of an individual experience is always framed by a broader cultural set and setting. Is psychedelic medicine viewed as a commodity or a sacrament? This question might appear peculiar, perhaps even provocative, but it is essential to the types of frameworks people arrive with, and hence to the types of outcomes that we can expect. It's not clear that the clinical environment is universally preferable. Other environments relying on communal care might be more suitable in certain cases, and this too is something that may be established through cultural controls. Psychedelic medicine promises to open up entirely new horizons for healthcare. It also calls for new ways of doing research and therapy. As we enter into this new, uncharted, and exciting terrain, we may need to reconsider some of our assumptions about proper ways of doing research and performing treatment. And this will summon great challenges, but potentially also pave the way towards immense gains. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, I'm Suresh Mutikumar from the University of Auckland, and my talk today is called Overcoming Confounds in Psychedelic Clinical Trials, Design and Measurement. And thank you for the organisers for the invitation to speak at this workshop. I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues whose ideas and discussions contributed to this talk, to acknowledge some of the funding that my research lab has received, and a couple of disclosures around funding and consulting from industry. So my talk is about the randomized controlled trial and trying to establish causation in psychedelic clinical trials. So the purpose of clinical trials, as we all know, is to establish the safety and efficacy of our interventions. And so the way we establish efficacy is by trying to establish a causal effect between the treatment and outcome. There's actually a kind of sort of hidden, mostly hidden logic to how this works. And it's built on what's called the Rubin causal model. And at its heart, it's built on the idea of the fundamental problem of causal inference, is that what we would like to do is be able, for any individual, is be able to identify the individual treatment effect, ITE. But unfortunately, due to reality, we can only expose any individual to one of our interventions, our treatment or control. So we're left with having to essentially do this across populations. And so rather than estimating individual treatment effects in clinical trials, we estimate the average treatment effect across populations, which is essentially the difference in the expected values between the response to treatment and controls. So that's what we need to make unbiased causal inference. And so unbiased causal inference requires us to have randomization of our participants to unit, to the interventions, a sufficient sample size that we're able to say that that randomization has been good enough, conceal of allocation to the team and participants. And then critically, and what this talk is going to revolve around, is the issue of double blinding. So I've included a quote here from the ICH guidelines, which nicely summarizes the purpose of blinding. So blinding or masking is intended to limit the occurrence of conscious and unconscious bias in the conduct and interpretation of a clinical trial arising from the influence which the knowledge of treatment may have on the recruitment and allocation of subjects, their subsequent care, and the attitudes of subjects to the treatments. And in particular, it's the latter part of the highlighted bit. So their subsequent care and the attitude of subjects to the treatments, and to limit bias that might come from that. And of course, the issue that we face in studies of psychedelics, and here I'm kind of including ketamine in this pile, but here's a study that I could have picked from any number of studies, which just shows that obviously when we give psychedelics, we have very large perceptual experiences that participants are going to experience. And so it becomes pretty obvious to the participant about which intervention they might have received. And so herein lies the crux of the problem, is that given the obvious psychoactive effects of psychedelic drugs, those in the active intervention group will likely know that they've received the treatment, and therefore they might show a greater treatment response due to expectancy effects. And on the other hand, those participants that receive a placebo intervention may know that they've then received the placebo intervention, and disappointment may actually decrease than what they would normally have as a placebo response. So we have two push-pull mechanisms there. One where you might have enhanced effects due to expectancy when they know that they've received the active treatment, and a decreased placebo response when they know they've received the placebo intervention. This creates something that I've titled the perils of abstraction. When we look and read papers looking at psychedelic RCTs, and we think about the kind of formalisms involved. So we might have our fundamental logic for our trial here, and maybe we have any particular paper that we might be looking at, and we see these results. I picked one of my own to sledge, and so you can see these difference between patients and controls, and you look at that and you think that looks nice, and then maybe you then take that up to the next level where you have a meta-analysis. And so the problem is, of course, is that these effects of expectancy and blinding, they get hidden in these kind of abstractions. So what I thought I'd do to you is actually play a video that shows not what happens in the abstract, but actually shows what happens maybe in the actual setting. So, and remove some of this abstraction so we can actually see what might happen in an actual clinical trial. So there's a couple of minutes of just this video extracted from BBC's The Drug Trial. So this will just take a couple of minutes to play, but there's some noteworthy things to pay attention to.
I just started bawling my eyes out. I haven't really cried properly for a long time, but I didn't feel scared or frightened. It felt okay. I was lying there and the tears were pouring out of my eyes, but they weren't sad tears, they were joyful tears.
Okay, so there's a nice example. And there's a lot of features there that you can kind of pick up on, but you can obviously see what I was talking about in her words, the disappointment of realizing that you've been allocated to the placebo group, which would raise your response here. And then potentially if you're expecting to have an effect and you realize that you've had it, then the expectancy would increase your clinical response. And so you're overestimating the treatment effects when this happens. And I guess it's unclear at the moment to what degree that overestimation is occurring and whether that overestimation accounts for the entire difference or what aspect of the difference. We can get back to that. And so following up on the kind of idea of the perils of abstraction, this group has looked at the blinding and a meta-analysis of clinical trials using the Cochrane risk of bias tools. And actually, it's kind of unusual when you look at it, is that actually the risk of bias for blinding has actually come up low or unclear in almost all of these studies. And this isn't the fault of the authors. This is just that it seems that the tool for actually evaluating blinding in the context of a psychedelic RCT doesn't really seem too valid. And so there's actually deeper problems as well. It's not only that, and I think the video shows us, it's not only that the participant becomes unblinded, often it's the therapist that will become unblinded as well. And you can see this in the video where you can kind of see that there's differential therapy going on, and that potentially creates the confound of therapeutic alliance. And we know that therapeutic alliance is one of the strongest mediators of successful outcome in psychotherapy. And one of the key things about the psychedelic kind of treatment paradigm is that often delivered not just as a drug intervention, but a drug plus psychotherapy outcome. And so if you have differential therapeutic alliance that's been caused by unblinding, then you have a confound. And I guess the kind of closing wrap on that section is that actually the content of psychedelic therapies are a little bit strange if you've been given the placebo, if you've been asked about all these mystical and unlocking experiences, but you received a low dose or a placebo. It's just a little strange if you're that participant. So if we get back to our causal model, which is, I guess, for many medical RCTs, the supplies, but actually when you involve psychotherapy is probably now a mediator of this outcome. And this is in itself a problem, that there might be some part of the efficacy that's directly from the drug and some of it that is mediated by psychotherapy, although we still don't know what the contribution of the mediation would be in this account. But if we now begin to consider the unblinding effects, that's when we start to get confounds popping up. And so the patient blinding, so the confounds are in red, we have patient deblinding and therapist deblinding, and those open up pathways for expectancy to now influence our outcome. There are ways that we could actually measure these blue boxes, and there are kind of tools that have been developed in various parts of the literature that could measure these outcomes. There are ways of measuring therapeutic alliance. You can use Likert scales to measure blinding, or VAS scales, and there are ways to measure people's expectancy about the intervention they're about to receive. So there are ways of measuring this stuff, but I guess we can ask the question, are the existing studies actually measuring expectancy and blinding so that we could actually look at the degree to which our treatment effects are actually contaminated? And so what we did in this analysis was that we looked at expectancy and blinding in previous RCTs. And here we looked at double-blind RCTs of ketamine and major depression, since there were a lot of them. And so we evaluated the papers to see whether they actually measured expectancy, and across means that they didn't measure expectancy. And we also looked at to see whether they measured blinding. And some of them did report blinding, most did not. And generally when they did report the blinding, you see that actually the blinding had generally failed. So this is just the second page of that table. We also looked at double-blind RCTs of psychedelics, gain expectancy, so the classical psychedelics, and we see again that expectancy generally wasn't measured, and although blinding was assessed better, generally it always failed. And this is just the open label trials of psychedelics where gain expectancy wasn't measured. There's not a lot of these measurements are actually taking place, and they haven't really been incorporated into clinical trial design yet. So it gets more complicated than though that, because of something called Phillips paradox, and this comes from a book from Jeremy Howarth, The Philosophy of Evidence-Based Medicine. And at its heart, of course, the purpose of a clinical trial is to become unblinded, because an efficacious intervention heals the patient. So imagine you were like in a surgery trial because your leg had been snapped in two and you're getting it pieced together, and then you have some double-blind intervention where you don't get the surgery and you get the surgery. And when you heal, you naturally figure out that you're in the treatment group, right? So, and you observe that not based on any side effects, but actually on the efficacy of the intervention. And Phillips paradox is such that the better the intervention, the more unblinded you become. So what we really need to do is start thinking about, when we measure whether someone has identified their intervention or not, there are actually two components to their identification. There's the therapeutic aspect, which I've just talked about, because they got better, but then there's the malicious aspect where maybe it's side effects or some kind of psychometric experience that has led them to identify whether they receive the intervention or not. So that raises the question of, if we are going to be asking deblinding questions, when should we ask the deblinding questions? And I guess our argument, and it may be wrong, it may be right, this just hasn't been done very much in literature, but we would argue that assessment of blinding should be done after dosing and after the kind of peak experiences are had, but before assessment is outcome assessment, and probably before any kind of psychotherapies take place in the post-intervention period. So the timing of blinding assessment treatment probably needs to be really thought through, because if you measure it at the end of trial, which most people, including ourselves, have previously done, then probably you're mixing up efficacy and malicious deblinding. And that kind of leads to the kind of a sort of more theoretical question about what actually is the aim of blinding in a psychedelic RCT. So this is a kind of argument we made, and it may be right or wrong. The purpose of blinding is about shaping belief, we argue. So if we consider blinding to be on a scale of -1 to 1, and B is the belief that someone has received a particular intervention. And when B is -1, they're completely sure they've received the placebo. And when B is 1, they're completely sure that they've received the active intervention. And 0 would be they're just completely unsure. What we're actually hoping for is that the distribution of blinding responses in the treatment group would completely overlap with the distribution in the treatment group. So you wouldn't be able to tell the two apart, and then there would be no confound, and you could proceed with your normal statistics. But the problem in a psychedelic RCT is that the effects are so obvious that the belief in the treatment group is invariably going to be 1. So what we argue is that actually what we need to do is set up our clinical trials so that we can get the belief in the control group to also be 1. So actually what we need to do is essentially, we need the patients in the control group to actually think that they are receiving intervention, and we need to design our all the aspects of our trial in order to try and get their belief, induce a false belief that they've actually received the intervention. And that sort of starts to lead into actually how we might design trials. And there's a whole host of trial designs that we could potentially use. But because we want our participants to have actually that false belief, we would argue that placebo lead-in designs and SPCD designs are actually inappropriate, because in these lead-in designs, you actually remove placebo responders. These are the ones who are most likely to have that false belief. But actually, these are ironically, I guess, these are the responders that we would actually like to keep. We will argue that crossover designs are probably pretty difficult. While crossover designs are nice for examining physiology, they're quite confusing when you have not only carryover effects of intervention, but carryover effects of the identification of the intervention by the participants. Delayed treatment designs don't do much to control expectancy or blinding. Some designs are too complicated. So that leaves us with essentially active placebo designs, which are good, and also dose response designs, which are potentially good, or pre-treatment designs that actually change the response to the drug. So those are all potentially useful designs, but the designs in and of themselves won't be enough possibly to shape that those beliefs in our participants, because expectancy is shaped throughout the trial. From the moment a participant responds to the advertisement, you're starting to tell them about the design of the trial. And then when they read the information sheets, you're telling them about the doses, the interventions. So it's known, for example, in depression that you can actually change the effect size just by telling, in standard antidepressant trials, you can actually change the effect size just by telling the participants the probability of the allocation that they're going to receive. So there are really questions like, do we even tell our participants the allocation ratios? And are we reporting that when we report our results? So there's all sorts of things that throughout the participant's journey through this clinical trial, where actually bias is going to be shaped. So there's some stages of the trial where they will actually have their expectancy shaped through the information that they receive, the way they talk to the experimental team, the questions they ask the experimental team, and the way that the experimental team responds to those questions about the interventions. And those can affect both the expectancy and the blinding that we'll see, and hopefully that we should be able to try to measure in these trials. So I'm going to kind of wrap it up there, and I have some sort of conclusions and questions. And I guess as I kind of have gone through this, I'd ask one of the key questions: do we actually have the experimental methods to demonstrate unbiased causal inference or efficacy of psychedelics? So are we actually able to estimate our average treatment effect unbiased by the deblinding and expectancy effects? And do we have the tools and the trial designs to actually achieve this? And I guess that's an open question, but I guess I'm also inclined to say at this point that we don't have those tools, or it hasn't been demonstrated yet. one of the things to note is that actually, once we start using all those confound adjustments, we're going to actually need very large trial sizes for that to work. And if that becomes just too difficult, or the trials become unwieldy, and we're not able to show unbiased causal inference in the context of a randomized controlled trial, perhaps we then should be applying other evidence in order to reach that establishment of efficacy. So, for example, applying the Bradford-Hill criteria and other sources of evidence. And some of those other sources of evidence could, for example, be around surrogate biomarkers. So these surrogate biomarkers, biological markers, maybe that are of efficacy, they might be less liable to be affected by placebo and expectancy responses, and they might play an important role potentially if ideal design can't be achieved. And so that is the end of my talk. Thank you for listening, and looking forward to a discussion later.
Hi, I'm Paul Applebaum from Columbia University, and I'm going to be speaking about the ethical considerations that we should be thinking about with regard to conducting psychedelic research. Let me start by saying I have no relevant financial or other disclosures to make here. So the place to start is with the obvious, which is some things are just the same when we're using psychedelics in research or other medications, including making sure that the participants in a study are informed about the nature and purpose of the study, the procedures that will be involved, including the use of placebo, the risks, benefits, alternatives to being in the study, and critically, the differences between being in this study and usual treatment. And one key difference in many studies is in usual treatment, you're guaranteed to get an active medication. In many studies, you may be randomized with a chance of getting placebo instead. We also need to ascertain that participants are capable of giving a competent consent and that they are actually providing a voluntary consent. So those are familiar to you and apply to every study. What could be different, though, about the ethics of doing research on psychedelics as compared with other medications, including other psychiatric medications? To answer that question, I want to focus on three specific issues, one being challenges in informed consent. The second, some unique boundary issues that arise with psychedelics. And the third, the importance of designing research to anticipate the actual way in which psychedelics will be used in clinical practice. And we'll consider each of those in turn. So first, with regard to challenges in informed consent. In conveying what the psychedelic experience is, investigators are faced with the reality that they are describing what many people consider to be ineffable experiences. People use terms to describe their psychedelic experiences that include, my awareness was transformed. I underwent a dissolution of my ego or a shattering of my ego. I had a shift in my values, my personality changed. Exactly how a person can understand and appreciate the impact on his or her life of a change in their personality or a transformation of awareness is not entirely clear. A second challenge is the absence of experience with the context of the experiment. So consider the nature of a psychedelic therapy session, which could go on for 8 hours with 2 therapists there while you are experiencing a psychedelic trip. Most people have not had that experience. Most people wouldn't know what that was like or even how to imagine it. And conveying that in an informed consent process may not be a simple matter. So what could be helpful approaches to dealing with the unusual nature of the information to be conveyed as part of the informed consent? One helpful approach might be to involve previous participants in the consent process. people who, without prior psychedelic experience, went through the therapy and can tell naive potential participants what at least their individual experience was like, and not just in the trial, the experimental administration of the medication, but also afterwards and in the outside world. Moreover, a video clip of the actual administration session can allow potential participants to see for themselves what's involved and what it might be like to be in that setting. A second challenge in informed consent deals with the investigators' expectations here. And here, particularly investigators who have used psychedelics themselves may be enthusiasts for the medication, and in their enthusiasm convey unreasonable expectations of benefit to potential participants. Anderson and colleagues in a recent Lancet Psychiatry piece wrote, even conservative individuals, and they're talking about investigators here, can become wildly enthusiastic about the potentials of psychedelics to heal and transform. Having a consent process not conducted by an enthusiast, but rather by a neutral colleague could help to mitigate this effect, and is something that IRBs might want to consider in this context. And of course, there are the expectations of potential participants. Anderson and colleagues again noted that psychedelic medicines can carry a truly uncanny allure. People are drawn to the possibility of having a trip, of having a psychedelic experience. And of course, that sort of allure is heightened by much of the media coverage that we see about the use of and potential benefits, although the word potential is often omitted, of psychedelics. So, for example, consider the piece that Ezra Klein, a noted journalist, published in the New York Times in 2021, entitled, "Can Magic Mushrooms Heal Us?" which included, among other things, the following, and referred to his own experience with psychedelics. It would be one more option for those who need it. And both evidence and anecdote suggest it would be life-changing for many. That would be enough. That would be so much. Participants are coming in, having scanned the internet, having read pieces like this, with what may be a set of unreasonable expectations about the experience, particularly since some number of them are going to be getting placebo in many of these studies, and not active psychedelic medication. Those expectations need to be monitored, and they need to be addressed as part of the informed consent process. Smith and Sisti in 2020 in the Journal of Medical Ethics have a very good piece, which I commend to all of you, addressing these issues of consent using psilocybin as their example. And we won't go through all of this because we don't have time today, but they suggest conveying information about the experience, about the potential long-term changes, about the mechanism of change. We'll talk about therapeutic touch in a minute. And then finally, asking questions that encourage reflection by the potential research subjects. Would any of these changes be difficult for you? Do you have further questions about this experience, its risks or benefits? To get people to think about what this may be like for them as part of the consent process. The second area of relatively, if not unique, at least quite different issues that need to be considered in psychedelic research are the boundary issues. Psychedelics may induce states of suggestibility and vulnerability. Many of you know that reports exist of sexual exploitation during unregulated use of psychedelics by therapists back in the 1960s. It was one of the motivations for the rather rigorous regulation of psychedelics that were instituted, that for many years shut down research on psychedelics. But such reports are not just historical. They exist today as well. So this is from CBC News In Canada, as psychedelic therapy goes mainstream, former patient warns of dangers of sexual abuse. And although the subheadline talks about sexual assault by her therapist, it was during a clinical trial that this took place, in this case of MDMA. This is and needs to be an ongoing concern. Now, of course, many studies are well aware of this and have taken approaches to preventing sexual misconduct by the personnel involved, including having both a male and female therapist as a team present for the session and taping therapy sessions. It may be that advanced planning for interventions can be helpful as well in order to reduce even perceptions of boundary violations. So Smith and Sisti suggest, for example, saying to potential participants, we can use our clinical discretion to support you during intense moments in the psychedelic experience. For instance, by holding your hand if you become distressed. However, we would never do this unless you wished. Would you like us to? And so addressing in advance the possibility of therapeutic touch as part of calming down someone who becomes agitated during a trip is one way of dealing with not necessarily the reality of misconduct by the therapists involved, but at the very least the perceptions of such misconduct. And I would note that although it's less talked about, post-therapeutic suggestibility has also been reported with the use of psychedelics. The third and final issue that I want to talk about, which is less commonly noted when talking about the ethics of research, is the importance of designing the research to anticipate the actual clinical use of psychedelics. So assuming studies continue to suggest therapeutic efficacy for a number of disorders for various psychedelic and related medications, they will become at some point available for clinical use. And I would suggest that it's important for the people who are designing studies to anticipate the issues that will without doubt arise as part of that use and design studies that can address those issues. This is often ignored in pre-marketing studies, but I want to suggest that it shouldn't be ignored here. So what are the issues that should be anticipated? One is application to more typical clinical populations. So if you look at studies of psychedelics today, you will find that they often exclude participants with personal or family histories of major psychiatric disorders or substance abuse. Whether such precautions are necessary is unclear, but it is clear that in ordinary clinical practice, they are not going to be adhered to. And without data on how vulnerable populations, defined in these ways, will respond to the medication, formulation of guidelines becomes very difficult. Here's an example for you. This is from the Carhart-Harris and colleagues' study in 2021 in the New England Journal of psilocybin in depression. And I've highlighted in red some of the exclusion criteria that are relevant to this issue. Immediate family or personal history of psychosis, history of serious suicide attempts, suspected or known presence of a pre-existing psychiatric condition like borderline personality that could jeopardize rapport. So let me just suggest that if we use clean populations exclusively for our research, we will never know how the medications perform with these other groups. And yet that's crucial knowledge for actual clinical application. A second issue that should be anticipated, more economical use of clinical time. So the current trials typically involve prep sessions and post-administration therapy sessions, along with 2 therapists who are present in the room for this extended session at which the psychedelic medication is administered. These sessions may take 8 hours each. I submit to you that it is extremely unlikely that this will be replicated when this gets rolled out into ordinary clinical practice. When psychedelic medication prescription becomes a profit center, there will be incentives that exist to prescribe for less severely ill patients, patients who might respond quite well to standard medications but haven't tried them, patients with less clearly diagnosed conditions or with conditions for which FDA indications don't exist and data don't exist, that is to say, off-label use, and precautions that were used in the research setting that raise the cost of treatment, like pre-session preparation and 2 therapists present at all times, are likely to be abandoned. I would note that all of these issues have arisen with for-profit IV ketamine clinics, which are the very clinics that are gearing up today to administer psychedelics once they become available for clinical use. What should be done in the design of clinical research to anticipate the likely conditions under which the medication will actually be used? Well, after basic efficacy of psychedelics is established for a particular condition, I would suggest studies should include people who are likely to be treated in clinical practice. Patients with active suicidal ideation or histories of suicide attempts, patients with family histories of serious mental disorders, patients with histories of substance use. It will also be important to assess more efficient means of administering psychedelics before commercial release takes place. And of course, a REMS is essential and should take into account the diagnosis for which the medication is being prescribed, the severity of the condition or its resistance to other forms of treatment, and the conditions under which it will be administered. In the absence of that, I think we will have the same kind of Wild West situation, if you will, that exists now with IV ketamine. So to wrap up, psychedelic research clearly raises some concerns that are similar to, but also concerns that are different from research on other classes of psychoactive medications. And just to recap, among the ethical considerations are the content and procedures of informed consent, the need for special attention to boundary issues, and perhaps most importantly, the generation of data that will actually address the ways in which psychedelics will be used in ordinary clinical settings so that there is an evidence base on which practices can be implemented. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Good afternoon. I'm here to discuss with you considerations of study design and the interaction between medications and what we call the practice of medicine in registration trials. Before I start, I want to acknowledge some of my colleagues who've contributed to this presentation. And I also want to give a brief overview of the presentation here. And I'm going to be talking about the evolving landscape of psychedelic research. I'm also going to be doing a very high-level regulatory background. And I'm going to be then diving into some unique challenges we see with these drugs. First, let's touch on the evolving landscape of psychedelic research. I think I've heard this question in a variety of ways, and I cannot tell you how many times I've heard it, but it's usually something close to this. Javier, how come the FDA hasn't approved a psychedelic yet? People have been studying them for years. What else do you need to see? And to which I usually say, yes, a lot of psychedelic papers were published from the 50s into the 70s and beyond that. But unfortunately, most of these suffer from a variety of methodological problems and would not be useful under today's more rigorous regulatory standards. Since the early 2000s or so, there's been a resurgence of high-quality research leading to a renaissance in psychedelic scientific publications. In fact, these days, it seems like popular media is inundated with overwhelmingly positive references to the drugs, which can potentially influence patient and therapist expectations, as we will explore later in this talk. This next slide here is an unpublished internal analysis, and it includes both research and commercial INDs, and it also includes drugs like ayahuasca, LSD, MDMA, psilocybin. And I just want you to see that we've also seen that increased interest, and particularly the last 5 to 7 years. I mentioned the limitations of the data derived from the hundreds of earlier scientific studies. And I also mentioned this beginning of the modern era of scientific research in psychedelics, which brings me to a well-received article published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2019. In it, the authors provide an evidence-based summary of the existing literature on the clinical application of psychedelic drugs in psychiatric disorders. The publication included other drugs such as LSD and ayahuasca, but I'm only going to focus on MDMA and psilocybin, which are the two drugs which have received the most public attention from drug development programs in recent years. So here we see a representation in this slide of some of the most salient MDMA trials, and I just want to draw attention to the study design. Yes, these are randomized double-blind studies, but in this particular instance here, both of these studies have a crossover component to it, which can introduce some difficulties from a regulatory point of view. We also see that these are small studies, right? And there's a variety of in the use of controls. And in these two studies, the primary outcome measures is the CAPS, I should say, which is something that we've accepted before and is well considered standard for assessing PTSD. In this next slide, we see a similar summary, but in this case, of psilocybin trials. And again, I want to draw attention to the variety of study designs. Again, usually small numbers, which can limit the generalizability of the data here, and also a variety of controls. And these examples here, we see a variety of primary outcome measures. Some of them we've never accepted for any indication in the agency. Now, what I wanted to highlight about this one article here is that the authors concluded that these randomized controlled trials support the efficacy of MDMA in the treatment of PTSD and psilocybin in the treatment of depression and cancer-related anxiety. However, they also note that the database is, and I quote here, insufficient for FDA approval of any psychedelic compound for routine clinical use, end of quote, and recommended continued research. Many of these studies have been informative in multiple ways. For example, some of these data supported the breakthrough therapy designations the FDA granted to MDMA and psilocybin. What we learned from these trials will also help us fine-tune the design of future studies, in particular, large and adequate, well-controlled clinical trials. And now let's focus on the regulatory background. And for this, I want to take a step back to set up the discussion of the regulatory issues by giving a high-level overview of how the FDA assesses new drug applications to determine whether or not they should be approved for marketing. So when we review an NDA or a new drug application, we consider the available treatment options, the treatment indications, and the evidence for both the effectiveness and the safety of the proposed new drug. If the drug is deemed to be effective and the safety concerns can be adequately managed, the favorable benefit-risk balance supports e-marketing approval. Let's also briefly look at our existing regulatory framework to see what, in my opinion, are the most relevant features of an adequate and well-controlled trial in relation to psychedelic drugs. So first, the study design permits a valid comparison with a control. The adequate measures are also taken to minimize bias on part of the subjects and the observers. And lastly, the methods of assessment are well-defined and reliable. Now, let's start looking into what unique challenges we face with psychedelic clinical trials. And as I get into that, I want to think that these, for me at least, are complicators of efficacy assessment. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the psychiatric community has seen an unprecedented effect sizes compared to traditional psychotropics. For example, in the treatment of depression. The following factors are associated with psychedelic treatment and can confound such comparisons. For starters, we have a highly engaged therapist and our monitors. We also have significant patient and therapist expectations, again, possibly fueled by that highly favorable media coverage we were talking about. We also have an elaborate therapeutic intervention, which usually increases the placebo response. So we have all of these things going on. And on top of that, because of the dramatic functional unblinding, not only do I know that I got the drug, I also happen to go through one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. So I have to ask myself, how can this not work? Additionally, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but psychedelics appear to have unique suggestibility properties. Well, what's the therapeutic impact of us telling our patients, this is really going to help you in this particular context? I think we can all agree that each of these therapeutic elements has a measurable impact in the therapeutic response, and that it is important to tease each of these contributions because one could conceivably market a sugar pill wrapped around this therapeutic milieu, and it will do well. Now, we're going to hone into two of these challenges that are important to consider in the efficacy assessment. Let's look at the first of these challenges, psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is a design feature that we are seeing in pretty much most of the recently published trials we mentioned a little earlier. Now, this treatment approach is a novel paradigm when compared to other registration trials we've seen, at least in the division of psychiatry, where no changes in psychotherapeutic status are permitted, and we do that in order to isolate the drug effect. As I see it, one of the main problems with the use of psychotherapy in this particular context is a lack of a rigorous definition of what these psychotherapeutic interventions are. I will briefly go through examples as described by Dr. Johnson and his colleagues in 2008. So on one end, we have preparatory psychotherapy. And here the goals are to prepare the patient for the drug treatment, right? We try to build trust, we try to build rapport, and we are hoping to establish the intentions and the goals of treatment. Then we could also have a drug treatment session. In here, the goal is to reduce adverse psychological reactions and facilitate therapeutic sessions. And lastly, we see integrated psychotherapy. And this could happen days, weeks, or even months after the treatment. And the goal here is to ensure psychological stability, process and integrate the experience. As you can see, psychotherapy is not just a confounding factor in this treatment model. It appears to be integral to the treatment as one, a safety feature, and two, to maximize treatment effect. However, we don't know what minimum components of the psychotherapeutic intervention are necessary to ensure safety. Ultimately, this is really important to us because we need to write a label to ensure safe use. We also don't know which features of the psychotherapy intervention are critical to the efficacy. What if all that's needed is building rapport, maybe some psychoeducation before the session, and perhaps providing a calming guidance through the experience? What if that's all we need? I don't know. But for us to fully be able to tease out the safety and efficacy contributions of psychotherapy in psychedelic trials, we would need well-done factorial studies. These will be highly informative to allow us to write a label. Now let's look into one problem that this also brings us. It's the practice of medicine exception. One important point to consider when thinking about psychedelic psychotherapy is that the FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine or psychotherapy. Now, given this exception, how might the FDA approach a new drug application for a psychedelic drug to be used in combination with psychotherapy? Well, there are some labeling approaches, and the FDA regulates product labeling to ensure that it contains the essentials for safe and effective use of the drug. And labeling regulations allow for specification that a drug should be used only in conjunction with another mode of therapy. And I give you the CFR there, where it says that an indication, a drug is used for an indication only in conjunction with a primary mode of therapy. Then a statement for the drug that the drug is indicated as an adjunct to that mode of therapy is necessary, right? So indeed, there are a few, actually there are several FDA-approved drugs that include psychotherapy-related content in their labeling. And let's look at some of these examples. And I just brought you three here: naltrexone for alcohol and opioid dependence, bupropion for smoking cessation, and buprenorphine for opioid dependence. And what I want you to know and note about this is that the descriptions of psychotherapy and labeling are very abbreviated and very general. Now, in addition to the inclusion in product labeling, another approach that we could use is, well, that we can consider, I should say, If some component of the psychotherapy were assessed to be critical for achieving safe use, will be the use of a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, or REMS. And the stipulations these are elements to assure safe use, and these could mean things like provider training or certification, special patient monitoring, and so on. It also notes that it must not be unduly burdensome on patient access to drug and must minimize the burden on the healthcare delivery system. And I want to highlight these two things, the unburden and minimize the burden. Brings me to the point I made earlier about the value of characterizing the minimal components of psychotherapy necessary. Now, I want to talk about another one of our unique challenges in psychedelic trials, and it's the issue of set and setting. I'm not going to discuss this in detail because of the previous presentation on this topic, but this is very closely related to the psychotherapy challenges we just covered. In contrast to most drugs, we usually do not pay attention to whatever setting our patients are in when they take their medications. And we also learned from the previous presentation that optimal setting may have a positive treatment effect even in the absence of a psychoactive drug. So again, I have to ask, what are the minimum requirements here? And how do we communicate this minimal requirement on a label? Now, the next of our unique challenges is, the next two of our unique challenges are making a valid comparison and minimizing biases. So, and this is kind of tricky. So I think we need various approaches to account for the dramatic functional unblinding. And let's look at what's been done before. In the context of psychedelic drug development, the use of traditional placebo as a control has significant problems. And this was covered by Suresh a little earlier too. And in addition to the functional unblinding, the concept of nocebo can be argued. However, the use of an inactive control allows us to contextualize the safety findings of the active drug. More commonly, psychedelic researchers have used other psychoactive drugs as active controls, for example, methylphenidate, benzodiazepines, niacin, and so on. Now, this introduces the difficulty of selecting a drug that has similar subjective effects, but that is not known to be therapeutic. Another alternative is the use of supersatural doses of psychedelic drugs. These doses may still have psychoactive actions, potentially reducing statistical power and increasing the likelihood of type 2 error. It is also possible that such dose could have a therapeutic effect, and in some cases, a negative effect, as we've heard argued. Of course, each of these approaches have their pros and cons. We can argue about all of them here. However, to help overcome the limitations of any single approach, an NDA could use different competitors in different studies. Here are some other recommendations for reducing potential biases. One of them is the use of a blinding questionnaire, which I think Suresh also discussed. A blinding questionnaire is desirable and can be very helpful in the conduct of additional response analysis. Another blinding strategy is the use of video and central raters to the treatment allocation and preferentially to visit number. The use of such ratings allows quality control, comparisons between raters, and calculations of inter-rater reliability scores. Now, in traditional drug trials, everyone, with the exception of the pharmacist, is blinded to treatment allocation. Here, the therapist monitoring the session can usually deduce the treatment assignment by observing the patient's behavior. Therefore, it will be preferable if the in-session monitor is not involved in post-session psychotherapy because their knowledge of the treatment could bias the delivery of therapy. And we heard that earlier here today. I remember Molly from NIH also. Now, I recall a study conducted by Dr. Griffiths in which he deployed multiple reasonable methods to try to minimize bias. Although these efforts were helpful, there was still some substantial functional unblinding. And acknowledging how difficult it is to minimize this functional unblinding, here's another option for you. It is possible to conduct pivotal trials without a placebo control. And I want to bring to your attention the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, Section 314, where it explicitly says, and I'm reading here, that a properly conducted dose-response study can be considered and adequate and well-controlled trials. For those of you interested in finding out more about this trial design, we have a guidance document for your reading pleasure. And I think conceivably you could have an NDA with just 2 of these trials, but we recommend that at least one study includes a placebo arm so we can properly characterize the safety of the drug. Now, it is possible that there is a threshold effect rather than a linear dose response, and that could be a risk for some sponsors pursuing this route. Finally, I want to talk about Edward Sellers and colleagues. They reviewed the general challenges inherent in conducting psychedelic research in an article published in Neuropharmacology. In it, they discuss some of the things we've been talking about, but I'm going to briefly highlight some additional challenges. The article points out the importance of understanding the dose-response relationship. For most drugs in our division, sponsors typically evaluate a range of doses across all phases of development to establish the lowest effective, usually effective, maximally effective, and maximally tolerated doses. This is important to maximize benefits and minimize adverse reactions. Again, how do we write a good label? Another challenge is that current psychedelic studies enroll highly selected patient populations. For example, patients with first-degree family members with schizophrenia or bipolar disorders are routinely excluded from these trials. Unless there is strong evidence that these treatments are unsafe for these patients, including these individuals in clinical trials where they're being closely monitored, may be preferable than attempting to identify these safety risks from uncontrolled post-marketing reports. Most current psychedelic studies are evaluating the treatment of a single episode of psychiatric illness. Now, we also need to understand the parameters for retreatment because of the episodic and relapsing nature of this condition. We also need a modern non-clinical safety database, and we're going to need some formal studies on abuse potential. As we have mentioned, we are in an era of increased interest in psychedelic research that only seems to be expanding, despite the existence of preliminary data suggesting that psilocybin and MDMA may be potential treatments for PTSD, depression, and other psychiatric conditions. There are still many unanswered questions about the safety and efficacy of these substances. The role of psychotherapy and setting in proposed psychedelic treatment paradigms poses unique regulatory challenges. To best demonstrate the efficacy of psychedelic drugs, it will be important to select appropriate treatment comparators and take all feasible steps to minimize bias. I've also highlighted additional challenges that will need to be addressed to support future marketing applications, such as generalizability, adequately understanding the dose-response relationship, and retreatment paradigms. I know that I've barely touched the surface of many of these topics, and that maybe I've brought you more questions than I've answered, but please know that we are here and open to finding solutions together with all of you. I want to thank you for your time.
Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you attending this thought-provoking workshop worldwide. Thank you for your participation and engagement thus far, as noted by the substantial number of questions received via the Q&A link these last 2 days. For certain, this area of research is not new, but poses substantial scientific, clinical, and regulatory questions that we as a community will be aiming to solve together. For certain, my hope is that this workshop is the first of a number of subsequent workshops that may be offered in order to keep these discussions current and embedding ongoing insights as we progress. My name is Susan Learned, and I will be your discussant and moderator for this last themes panel discussion. I'm a longtime psychiatry and neurology, pharma exec, and medicines development researcher, and the majority of my experience has been focused in psychiatric, neurologic, and substance abuse drug development. Fundamentally, I'm an internal medicine physician, a pharmacist, and a neurobehavioral clinical pharmacologist. And I recently left pharma to start my own consultancy business and would like to disclose that I am providing R&D consultation to Reset Pharmaceuticals, which has an interest in psychedelic drug development. This session has raised so many scientific and research questions. Perhaps interestingly, and seeing Javier's presentation, I perhaps may be one of a few workshop participants who is actively involved in the development of 2 of those 3 drugs referenced that include psychotherapy or counseling in their labeling. Now, and purposely being provocative here, years later, post-marketing, we also much better understand the impact of the role of psychotherapy from a safety and efficacy perspective in the administration of those products, and certainly understand that what we thought perhaps may be necessary regarding psychotherapy or counseling interventions for successful treatment outcomes decades ago has not been proved to be the case. And I reference bupropion or Zyban and buprenorphine or Suboxone in particular here. For certain, a huge question remains, and referenced by many of our panelists as to the role, including extent and impact of psychotherapy and the outcomes realized by psychedelic treatment. This will be a theme we'll further explore with our panelists. Ido brought to light the key impacts of set and setting to therapeutic outcomes in the clinic. The role of physical surroundings, music, privacy, a trusting relationship with the therapist, a preparatory session to manage expectations, the therapeutic framework, and an integration setting are key set and setting covariates that have been acknowledged to be integral to a participant's therapeutic outcome. However, to implement all of these set and setting requirements per se poses significant costs from both a dollar and people resource perspective. Just think of the cost for multiple pre-treatment preparatory sessions, an 8-hour treatment session, and 1 or more post-treatment integration sessions. Say nothing about any costs related to any required training and certification that may be necessary to obtain approval to administer this type of therapy or counseling. Both Ido and Javier asked the crucial question, what part of the current process may be sacrificed? Furthermore, Ido raised the question, could the effect of psychedelic therapy be achieved without drug and only set and setting? To date, clinical research suggests that it is a combination of set and setting and the drug that results in transformative responses in patients. However, what part of the regime is mandatory? Javier reiterated the complicating role of psychotherapy in set and setting as they relate to unique regulatory challenges. Ido brought up the concept of cultural controls. That is the control of non-pharmacologic factors and understanding their relative weight of importance in the ultimate outcomes in patients or participants, and the suggestion that through scientific study, one may have a much better understanding of these. Suresh spent time speaking to the problems of blinding and expectancy, both therapist and participant, and the concept of differential therapeutic alliance, which is thought to be a very strong mediator of outcome. Expectancy factors have been shown to enhance the effect of psychedelic test treatment, whereas a decreased placebo response has been observed due to disappointment in participants who know or strongly believe that they received the placebo-controlled treatment. So moving on to blinding, I believe all of our speakers touched on this complicating factor in current clinical trial design to date. And this relates to both therapist and participant blinding or unblinding as significant confounders. Although there are ways to measure expectancy and blinding, most randomized controlled trials conducted to date have not been assessing these. Suresh spoke about Phillips' paradox and the question of when deblinding questions should be asked within a clinical trial. And unlike what has historically been done to date, Suresh's analysis suggests that these questions should be posed after dosing and after peak treatment effects have been observed, but not before post-intervention integration visits or psychotherapy. Regarding the role of expectancy, should we be telling patients during the informed consent process that they have a particular chance of receiving active treatment versus placebo? Obviously, this type of information can impact expectancy and bias. Suresh and Paul both commented on this complicating factor and ethical dilemma. Suresh raised excellent questions at the end of his talk. Do we have the experimental tools and designs to demonstrate unbiased causal inference for psychedelics? What other evidence could be used to establish efficacy for psychedelics? And are there surrogate biomarkers that could be utilized? We certainly will be addressing these with the panel. Paul mentioned several challenges in the informed consent process as it relates to trials with psychedelics. First, the potential personal impact of psychedelics is difficult to understand and relate to an inexperienced participant. The absence of experience with the context of an experiment may limit the appreciation of the actual procedure. A helpful approach was proposed to involve previous patients or participants in the consent process, or perhaps to provide a video clip of an administration section. Secondly, investigator expectations, especially with PIs who use psychedelics themselves. They may be too enthusiastic about the power of psychedelics to transform or cure patients of their ailments. And perhaps a helpful approach there would be to have the consent process done by an inexperienced third party. Third, the expectations of potential participants. And please note the table of suggested disclosures to psilocybin patients presented by Paul. And finally, boundary issues. Psychedelics, as discussed, may induce a state of suggestibility and vulnerability. This was documented decades ago and unfortunately associated with abuse of participants by their therapists. A helpful approach may be to include both male and female therapists with the participant. Paul further spoke on the importance of designing research to anticipate clinical use of psychedelics post-marketing. It's important for clinical trial designers to anticipate issues that will arise post-marketing. One issue is generalizability and the application to patients with major psychotic disorders or substance abuse who are often excluded in regulatory clinical trials. We also need to very much consider the economical use of clinical or clinician time. As we previously discussed, currently the paradigm suggests a substantial amount of time is required by clinic staff. And thirdly, we have to be concerned about non-evidence-based use of psychedelics, such as what has occurred previously with ketamine clinics. What should be done to anticipate likely conditions of clinical use post-marketing? And Paul suggested that after basic efficacy and safety has been established, studies should include patients that have previously been excluded in registration trials. Those perhaps with immediate family histories of psychotic disorders or schizophrenia, suicidal tendencies, and pre-existing psychiatric disorders. Many of our panelists pointed to REMS as essential to ensure safe use of psychedelics. However, should REMS programs be tailor-made to the drug, diagnosis, severity, and conditions of administration, or generalized? One could envision that different psychedelics pose different safety concerns, particularly in very different patient populations of treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, and substance use disorders, just to name a few. Furthermore, REMS are negotiated with FDA in advance of an approval decision. If the safe administration of a psychedelic requires adjunctive psychotherapy, how is the agency expecting to monitor the practice of medicine? Javier brought up this intriguing regulatory challenge, which goes far beyond labeling. Michael provided an excellent talk in the previous session about the MAPS PTSD clinical development program with MDMA and what they've learned about clinical trial design throughout that process. Given his experience, we've asked him to also participate on the panel for theme 3. So we'll now start the Q&A and open discussion section with the panel. I'd like to remind everyone to please stay on mute unless you are talking. That'll include myself, and note that I will do my best to scan the questions coming in from the audience during the session. So at this time, I'd like to make sure that all of our panelists have their cameras turned on, please. Okay, we've got everybody. Nice to see you. Fantastic. So let's start our Q&A session. The first question: what should the role of psychotherapy be in the psychedelic treatment schema, and how do we determine which aspects of the schema are mandatory or necessary versus nice to have?
Well, I think we need a series of clinical trials to begin to sort that out. You know, once we've finished our second phase 3 trial, speaking of MDMA, and I think a parallel is true of the others, you know, if we end up establishing safety and efficacy and get approval, then I think part of the challenge of ongoing research will be to figure out what's necessary and what isn't. And I think there's going to be a lot of room for individual variation. So I think it'll be partly a matter of realizing some people need this same level of support and the same amount of therapy, and other people may need less. And so I think we'll just continue to learn about that, which is true of other, you know, history of other forms of psychotherapy in particular.
Anyone else want to tackle that? It's a challenging question. Because I think it could be not just even individual within a particular disease like PTSD and the MDMA program, but it could be very different between diseases as well. So I think we're talking about, you know, a decent amount of heterogeneity. You know, what may be required for nicotine dependence and smoking cessation may be completely different than treatment-resistant depression, and the risks may be very different too, given one of the reasons for the psychotherapy is for safety. So,
you know, that question may interact with the question you raised in your summary about what the content of a REMS in this instance should be. And it may be that in the absence of the kind of evidence that would suggest that, for example, psychotherapy, the number of psychotherapy sessions, the number of therapists can be reduced safely, or for whom they can be reduced safely, that the REMS might well require fidelity to the demonstrated experimental interventions, and thereby encourage the testing in controlled circumstances of alternative approaches. Unless this kind of evidence can be generated prior to approval, which would require some restraint on the part of, you know, the forces that would like to see this approved as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Javier, do you have a comment on that, on the REMS?
Well, I don't work for the group of people who work on REMS, so I want to be careful about not speaking on their behalf, but I can tell you a couple of things about it. Yes, it needs to come from the sponsors, right? It is proposed by the sponsors, and we negotiated with them. And some of the things that I mentioned there, that we're trying to be the least burdensome for patients and to the healthcare system. But there's another thing that I also want to bring up here, and again, this is me, not the agency, is that the REMS can be patented. And there's something to be thought about here, is that since the beginning of REMS, some companies and sponsors have used this to stifle in competition from other sponsors, right? So we really have to be careful about what goes in there. And as a matter of fact, there are groups of sponsors who sometimes work together. So there are shared REMS. So you can tackle the same problems together, right? So there's completely different approaches that things can take, but it's something to be thoughtful about now. And as we move into the future, I guess that's the only thing I'm going to say about that.
Absolutely. And what do we think about the feasibility? If we think of the end game, which is these products actually are approved and they're available for patients, given the psychotherapy paradigms that are being used in current clinical trials or clinical trials that have completed recently, how feasible do we believe those paradigms are for in the real world setting to be able to be implemented and paid for and reimbursed? Not only from a dollar money perspective, but from a people resource perspective in most practice settings.
Well, I have a comment about that. I think it's going to be challenging, certainly, because it's a different model. But for instance, Elliot Marseille, University, the health economist at UCSF, did an analysis based on our phase 2 data. And it looks like it's going to be a very effective, cost-effective treatment, although more upfront costs. So part of it will be demonstrating to insurance companies that this is actually going to save them a lot of money, but they'll have to spend a little more in the beginning, because if it effectively treats PTSD, you know, that that can be very cost effective. And I also think that, we're already planning a study with group therapy. Again, I think there are going to be a lot of things we can learn about how to make it more cost effective. But even with this model, with 2 therapists, it's ultimately cost effective, but it's a matter of having the system adjust to how to fit this in. I think that is going to be very challenging, but possible.
Thanks. Anyone else want to address that? I know some of you are in very different practice settings.
Well, I could also say a couple of things here, and I want to highlight that sometimes people don't really understand what we do. There's a lot of misconception, but our goal is to get safe, to establish efficacy, and once the efficacy is established, that it can be safely used, right? And one thing about psychotherapy that we keep talking about in circles here is that, yes, for pretty much all our drugs, for all conventional drugs, we know that psychotherapy in combination with the drug is usually better than the medication alone. We all know that. But here, I think the different paradigm is that you could argue that the psychotherapeutic component and the set and setting component can be part of safety, right? And that is I think one of the things that we need to establish is somehow assessing what are those minimal features of both the psychotherapeutic component and the set and setting are essential for safe use. And I don't know how to tease it apart except for maybe suggesting factorial studies. And every time we've brought out factorial studies with sponsors, people freak out because they're bigger studies, they're complicated, logistically speaking, they're costly. I don't know if this is something that could be funded through government or what, but that could ultimately help us tease those things apart and help us write a label, which I think it's essential here. Maybe something I wanted to put out there.
If I can add, I think that's a really important point about the safety, because these are not trivial experiences, and things can get stirred up. People can have more symptoms temporarily before they feel better, and we prepare them for that. But I think it's really true that if I'm concerned about safety, if there's not enough support to go with these intense experiences, especially for people with severe PTSD or severe depression.
Yeah, absolutely. So I could also see where this, this minimum amount, that was asked about in a number of your presentations, what could be sacrificed in either the psychotherapy component or set and setting may be very different between patient populations. Because I agree with you. I think, the severe PTSD population that you're doing the MAPS trial with is very, very different than a classical nicotine smoking cessation patient population.
Yeah, and we did include people with past serious suicide attempts, some with several of those. So I think there could have been problems if there hadn't been enough support.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Related to this, do you guys think that from at the end game piece again, do we think that sponsors are going to need to actually justify the amount of psychotherapy that is required from a safety and efficacy standpoint in order to obtain reimbursement? And I guess this goes back to, I know, Michael, you said that a pharmacoeconomic assessment was done with regards to the PTSD program and that therapy paradigm. But I'm just wondering if that may be required by CMS or other, and I'm thinking now, not just within the US, but other payers and other reimbursement bodies, because it is a bit unusual compared to other drug development.
It would be unusual in its own right, I think, for payers to insist on an extensive psychotherapeutic component. We've seen in the real world exactly the opposite happen, right? Payers are very resistant to, much more resistant, let's say, to paying for psychotherapy than they are to paying for pharmacologic interventions. And I would expect some of the pressure to ratchet down the degree of psychotherapeutic involvement in administration of these medications will in fact come from the payer community. It may be counterproductive. It's counterproductive elsewhere in the realm of mental health treatment, but that's not to say that we can't expect that it may happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Ido, this is, oh, go ahead, Suresh. Sorry, I didn't see you.
No, it's just, so we're discussing the minimal set of psychotherapeutic things to evaluate safety, but I don't think you can separate that from the efficacy element. As you strip out those psychotherapeutic elements to establish safety, that could obviously impact the efficacy at the same time. So really you have to do that within the context of an actual efficacy trial, because if you strip it down and you're safe, but it might not work anymore, so.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the component. I think we probably could find out that there's a certain amount that's required for safety, and that may be less than what's required for optimal efficacy, or vice versa, right? And depending upon the target patient population.
You know, there have been a couple of comments in the Q&A with regard to an aspect of the current reality that we haven't directly addressed, which is city and state level initiatives around the country, Oregon being the poster child, although that hasn't formally rolled out yet, to legalize the possession and use under varying circumstances of psychedelics in the paradoxical situation in which they remain Schedule I agents, and therefore their possession and use would be a violation of federal law. But nonetheless, local jurisdictions, a number of cities around the country, as well as states, Oregon again being in the forefront here, have passed legislation to legalize their use in one way or another. It's not at all clear, I don't think. It's certainly not clear to me how those initiatives are going to ultimately interact with federal law, although it's quite similar to what's going on with medical marijuana, which remains a controlled substance under federal law, but is obviously widely used and officially tolerated in many states. One of the downsides that particularly concerns me about those initiatives, which are often touted as increasing access and cutting through the bureaucracy associated with formal approval of new medications, is that they come without any restrictions on use at the city level, or restrictions that so far, in the case of Oregon, for example, haven't yet been formally created and may or may not resemble the kinds of considerations that we're talking about here. I think we need to acknowledge that that's a potentially problematic but real world initiative that's going on. There was a bill to do something even more radical before the California legislature this year. There may be a referendum in California that would bypass the legislature on that issue, and these are real things to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. I would think there would also, like the medical marijuana situation, there's no standardization in drug product supply either. So people don't really know exactly what they're getting, you know?
Right, they still under federal law can't be produced and distributed legally. And so they have to be obtained from somewhere else, which means the underground market, which, as you say,
yeah,
who knows what you're getting in any particular packet.
Absolutely. So, Ido, before we leave this, this particular question, I was very much intrigued. I'm sure others were too, about this cultural controls project. And, you know, what you were mentioning, where one could control for non-pharmacological factors and determine the relative weight of importance of these. And I think, are you able to describe a little bit more to those of us who may not know more about this, about what is exactly done and how we may be able to get to what are the more important factors or those that are weighted the most? That would be greatly helpful.
Right. So I should first start by saying that it's a project that hasn't been done yet exactly in this way. We have some proposals, we have some research going in this direction, but the most basic way is just arranging studies that have multiple arms that instead of controlling for placebo, you control for context. So you start with major ones like a relative efficacy of different forms of therapy, or of music, or work with intention, or preparation, all of these different elements. And the challenge here is really the intricacy of this process, because you have so many different types of details you can control for. So potentially you need quite a lot of studies or sub-studies to go through all of these many factors and sub-factors. And another challenge, and again, I'm saying this is something experimental, where we see how, and we're seeing throughout this session how psychedelic medicine challenges a lot of the accepted ways of doing things. So secondly, this might be dependent on other elements of context, like the personality or the background of the patient. So some people prefer classical music, others prefer electronic music. So it's hard to arrive at any final result. And it may be because setting is no less an art form than it is a science. So there is maybe no perfect setting, and it's quite dynamic. And so it's a proposal that I think is the most logical way to go. And at the same time, it's far from certain that pharma companies have the interest of going this way. So it's a question who and how this will be done. And as said, it's already happening to some extent, just not coming at the moment from drug companies, but more from academic institutions. And I should also mention another possibility that has its own problems, but it's not as cost-effective, cost-intensive, and that's using automatically generated big data, and that is using apps and virtual reality technologies to monitor behavior and correlate it with data. And so that will be cost-effective, but that raises a whole host of other challenges, like privacy and general ambivalence about the nature of the digital landscape today that a lot of people share. So you have these two options. One of them is very labor-intensive and cost-intensive, but will do wonders and opens up really interesting horizons. And the other one is also intriguing, but has a whole host of other challenges.
That was really helpful, because I wasn't sure if actually we just weren't aware of that this had already been done, and we were struggling to find where this was published. So I'm glad to know, though, that it is underway. It's a proposal, and that's good. That's great. I would think actually companies, as well as maybe governmental agencies and academic institutions, would be very interested in this project.
And there are more and more of these studies taking place, maybe not always under this sort of title, but a lot of the studies that I mentioned in the slides of my talk, they're going this way, even though it's still not conceived as this general, broader project, big project that we really need to tackle.
Right, absolutely. But I think it's it's going to be really important, because as we had the discussion with psychotherapy and what are the minimal important components, which of course may be different based upon patient populations, set and setting may be the same thing, right? What could be very, very important for one set of patients may not be as important for another set. But it would be good to understand what are the drivers there so that, you know, even if it has to be individualized, we actually know what are the key components of a patient, whether it's their disease state, the severity, their personality, whatever the situation may be, would be driving what would be necessary.
Right, and I want to add that we can find here really an incentive to begin a conversation that's long due in general in medicine, and a conversation that's been happening alongside without direct connection in the field of placebo studies, but really this whole idea that the issue of context is no less relevant than pharmacology, and we haven't been giving this the same level of attention. And I think psychedelic medicine can really help change the tune here.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to comment on that? No. Okay. So given blinding or unblinding challenges in trials with psychedelics, should study participants be told the likelihood of receiving an experimental drug versus a placebo?
I think the answer to that is that, so there was a paper by Rutherford a couple of years ago, and they showed actually that if you tell the participants the probability of receiving the active intervention, that actually correlates, that's actually associated with an increased effect size or decreased effect size. So actually telling that piece of information to the participants will change the effect size. That was a standard antidepressant. So I think whether you tell them or not is probably secondary to having a plan for when your participants ask you that question, or having a standardized way of delivering that information, because this happens in trials, right? Participants just then ask an experimenter, oh, what's the chances? Because that might not be an information sheet. So the study team needs to have a standardized script that they then reply to those questions. So that all needs to be thought through in advance, all those kind of questions. But typically this kind of stuff isn't reported in trials.
Javier, were you trying to say something?
I could say a couple things here. I've tried to speak about this publicly before, and I've actually had several conversations with some of my colleagues internally, actually pretty actively, and in some instances I've heard, like, we can never blind these agents. Why we even try? And the reason why we have to try is because, for whatever reason, these drugs have a history, and at some point when we get the question, we get a new drug application, and we have to answer to the world why we approve these drugs, we want to stand in solid science, right? So I think one of the, maybe I did it clumsily in this presentation because of the lack of time, but there are a variety of approaches we can take to blinding, and all of them have pros and cons, and we can't really rely on each one of them, right? But we could do a combination. We can stack the odds to kind of obfuscate things the best we can. That's all we're really, I think, asking for sponsors when they come in through the door. And maybe you could see an NDA. Usually an NDA requires at least 2 trials, right, to replicate the findings. Is that maybe we have different approaches in different studies, right? I talk about a dose response study, and if there is a dose response curve, beautiful. We can use that as an adequate and well-controlled trial. That could be done even without a placebo, right? Now the placebo helps us characterize the safety of the drug, right? So maybe we can add an arm there, or we can have another one that's just pure placebo control, or we can have a variety of psychoactive substances. I actually had this topic of obfuscating assignment ratios. I had it in my presentation that I saw that Suresh was briefly talking about it, so I removed it. But the point is that if we do a variety of these approaches, and we can see it in multiple studies, and the efficacy is still saying, yes, this thing do really work, then we have no further question other than, okay, are the safety, are the risks, do we warrant, and can we safely manage them? And then we can move to an approval process, right? So that's what I wanted to say about that. I think it's a very complicated issue. Yes, I think, you know, if you've gone through one of the most significant experiences of your life, one of the top 5, I remember reading a paper by Dr. Griffiths in which a third of people had said that it was their most significant experience of their life. And another third said that it was one of the top 5. So we're talking about 2/3 of people saying this is the most or one of the most significant of their life. We can't really mask that, right? So so that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. That was very, very, very helpful. And around, oh, Ido, did you want to say something?
Yes, please. Well, I want to say I really like what Javier was saying there in terms of exploring this issue of efficacy and safety from diversity of perspectives, because we have these two separate questions, which is one is the question of blinding, or the issue of blinding, which is very difficult to achieve this perfect blinding. But the other one, and which we shouldn't forget about, is really exploring what are the optimal results that we can achieve. And these two don't always go together. So while I wouldn't suggest forsaking or sacrificing RCTs by any means, and the blinding, I think that it would serve us well to complement it with other types of trials, perhaps comparative trials, or other types of research apparatuses, and so reach a grander picture that encompasses both the blinding as much as possible, but also reaching the most optimal idea about what we can achieve in terms of efficacy.
Yeah, absolutely. This is complex, isn't it? It's very, very complex situation. Okay. So Suresh, he showed a video during his presentation illustrating an example of a clinical trial where one subject had high expectancy and had a larger than expected treatment effect when he felt he had received the active treatment, whereas another subject was disappointed and had a lower than typical placebo effect when she realized that she likely had not received active treatment. These are both confounders in clinical trials of psychedelics. How do we characterize the impact of those confounders on our overall treatment response?
Well, I'm not sure what to say, but it's, you know, the expectancy and the disappointment have been discussed. Another thing we're seeing now is, as the expectancy has increased dramatically since our first trial in 2004, now we're seeing some people who have, who think they've gotten MDMA, but they're comparing their experience to what they've read about in the newspaper, and they're judging that they're disappointed that theirs isn't this mind-blowing, blissful experience that they were expecting, even though they've clearly been prepared for the fact that sometimes the difficult experiences are an important part of it. So it's interesting how many different ways the expectancy can cut, even disappointing people that got the active drug sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think that goes to, you know, is the actual qualification or quality of the subjective experience actually the required for that treatment outcome. When some patients who don't have that newspaper description of an experience actually still go on to have treatment benefits, right? Even though their experience is very different than what they may have anticipated.
Absolutely, yeah. We've, you know, this becomes kind of anecdotal because we haven't had a way to really track this formally, but certainly some of the people with the biggest improvements we've seen over the years have been people who have had a really tough time in their early sessions. And so but they didn't have it as much expectation at the time. So now, in a way, it's the expectancy about what they've read that gets in the way of them just really appreciating that this is a therapeutic process, even though it's a difficult one. So that's a part of the preparation, I think, that we try to do.
Absolutely. No, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Michael. I wanted to move on now to REMS and talk a little bit about this. We mentioned it a little bit before. I think all of you pretty much pointed to REMS as essential to ensure safe use of psychedelics. However, do we believe these programs should be tailor-made to the disease, the severity of the patient, so the diagnosis, the conditions of administration, or more generalized? And I know I think Paul brought up the fact that, and Javier did as well, that sometimes companies actually go together to develop REMS programs. And I know, for instance, everybody's very well aware of the Roche isotretinoin REMS program. If you want to develop a new isotretinoin molecule or any tretinoin, you can buy into that REMS program. It's very expensive, but you can do that. But I think what we're talking about here is we're looking at very different medicines, but perhaps different medicines being developed for different indications. And do we think that a standardized REMS program, even just by drug or by patient population, is something that's realistic? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Javier, I think of all of us, probably knows the most about REMS, but let me just say two things, which is, one of the drugs that was introduced with a very strict REMS was buprenorphine. And there are things we can learn, I think, both helpful and maybe less helpful from that experience. On the helpful side, one of the requirements of the REMS was that in order to be authorized to prescribe and dispense buprenorphine, you needed to go through an educational process. I suspect that would be very helpful here as well for all of these compounds, which most practitioners have no or little direct experience with. Less helpful, perhaps, is that the initial REMS there was criticized very heavily for being overly restrictive in terms of the number of patients that any one practitioner could treat. It was limited to 10 initially, and there was an enormous demand for bup, and that could not be satisfied given that degree of restriction. But it was eased over time, and I think the lesson there is whatever the initial REMS is, and there may be reasons to be more cautious and stricter at the inception, it's not a permanent set of rules. They can be modified over time as additional evidence develops. And so the question, may be broken down and made easier by asking, based on what we know now, what should a REMS look like, recognizing that 5 years from now, or 3 or 2, we may not know a whole lot more, at which point we can refashion the nature of the REMS.
Yeah, Paul, I've lived through that buprenorphine saga, and I can tell you, and I think Nora can speak on this as well. Even though the patient numbers have increased over time that are allowable to be treated for each physician that's waiver trained, the issue is still getting that 8-hour training. And that requirement of having that 1 day of training, which doesn't sound like a lot, has been burdensome. And there's some docs that just say, I'm not treating this patient population because I got to do this training and keep up with the recertification. I think it's, and unfortunately, I think, what piqued my interest, I think, in psychedelics is that I think a lot of programs are proposing perhaps training certification hours that could be far in excess of an 8-hour day for therapists to get qualified per se to administer psychotherapy or counseling, what we're calling it, right, as an adjunctive treatment with the psychedelic. And I do worry about patient access to the wider population if that's going to be required. So I think that's something that we'll have to kind of just sort out as we go along. And again, I'd love to hear Javier's input on this as well, because the other piece of this is, you know, if that's the key component that's allowing safe administration, is that it's in this controlled environment, it's only administered in this controlled environment. How is the agency planning to govern that, you know, over REMS? Because again, it's, you know, the psychotherapy component is more like medical practice, right? And people practicing under a license. So yeah, it's interesting. But Javier, I'd love to get your input on that.
Okay. Again, I want to preface this with the comment that I am not with a group of people who works at the REMS, but I do have a couple comments. If we are asking about what could this look like, and I also want to get that point to Paul, is that these are not set in stone, right? These are things that we could revise over time with more data as we learn more, as real world information comes back to us. For me, when I conceptualize, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, but when I conceptualize the classic psychedelics versus the empathogens, right? I think of the journey a little bit different, right? Like I feel that the classics it's a journey inwards, right? I'm looking inside and trying to, and that's kind of what's encouraged. You're blind, you listen to your music, and you're going inside of your mind. With the MDMA assisted psychotherapy, the medication is there to help you have that outgoing bond, if you will, with the therapist, right? So that in itself, I think, introduces different paradigms, right? And we talked briefly about, for example, the issue of sexual abuse. There's an example here, right? And the REMS could look into certifications. It could also look into things like this setting in which this drug or compound is being administered. It could, I'm just trying to think about how this would look into something for MDMA versus something with psilocybin. I can start imagining the psilocybin and classic kind of aggregating and working on things together. And even then, if we're only talking about depression, right? But if the indications start changing, I think this could also change. So I can see them go. I could see the classics going in that direction of doing something as a group, and then I can see MDMA going on their own way, at least until we have other empathogens that maybe would present a similar problem. But at least there, I can see the bifurcation, if you will. I'm not sure I'm giving you a lot, but from very high level, that's how I see things going. In my opinion, again, not representing the agency, but.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful. Ido.
Yeah, I want to also comment on that issue of specialized versus generalizable in terms of different drugs or different conditions that are being treated, and in terms of the setting proper. And so while I realize that there are specialized components, I think there are also many elements that can be generalized and make things more simple and transparent. And this is because basically the basic principles of setting are the same, and they're even quite similar regardless of whether a psychedelic is involved. because psychedelics amplify the experience of the environment, but the basic parameters of having somebody you trust, having an environment you enjoy, having positive expectations, clear intentions, all of these things are conducive for therapy, for positive experience in the world more generally. And so these principles are quite, they belong together in many ways. And they're, again, not so different from the principles around placebo response, which are, again, expectancy, intention, preparation, social environment, physical. And placebo is very generalizable. So, I mean, across conditions. And so like in the case of placebo, I think that there are many elements of this that can be generalized and should be generalizable, and which would actually help us, again, think about this more broadly in the field of psychedelics and even beyond it.
Susan, you're muted.
Sorry. I was just saying, Michael or Suresh, anyone else have any comments on that? No? Okay. Everyone wants to stay far away from REMS. So that's, finally, I was hoping to close this session out with these last questions that Suresh posed at the end of his talk, because I think they are very insightful questions. And I would love to have the panel's input on these. The first question was, do we have the experimental tools and designs to demonstrate unbiased causal inference for psychedelics?
Maybe I should start since I wrote the question. I think maybe we do, but no one's ever tried it yet in an actual control. So we do have a lot of scales out there that can measure various bits and pieces. And so those do exist, but it's never been tried in a large trial before. And then the thing that hasn't really been addressed is how we would then develop, with all those measurements, how we would then develop the statistical models to actually incorporate those into estimating actual treatment effect. And that work hasn't really been done either from a statistical point of view.
Is anyone else working on this that we know of, Suresh? We don't know. Okay. Very intriguing. I think it's something that needs to be done, right? But yeah. His second question was, what other evidence could be used to establish efficacy for psychedelics? And I would love to hear this from both a clinician practitioner standpoint as well as a regulatory standpoint.
Well, I think from a clinical researcher standpoint, a practitioner standpoint, I think one of the most powerful bits of information is, concrete changes in people's lives over time following the treatment. I think, that's, we haven't focused much on that, but maybe that's one of the kinds of things we need to put more value on as we find challenges to our double-blind trials. We need to keep doing those, but start looking at other information that points to this being real and important changes in people's lives. And, so when you see somebody who's gone back to work when they couldn't work before, when they couldn't leave the house, and now several years later, they're still working and they have a garden and they're exercising. It's hard to measure that, but we've seen lots of anecdotal information like that I think should be taken more seriously, and is pretty powerful.
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear what Javier says about what's the FDA prepared to do with that.
No, I agree with that. One of the things that, at least, again, personally, when I started looking into this, is that, so we have these treatment paradigms where we're taking these medicines every day, and we see maybe some people getting better, and so on. And here we have a completely different treatment paradigm where one treatment can potentially change things. And what really drew my attention at that point was that we were looking into the future. We were not looking just a few weeks afterwards. We're sometimes looking a month afterward. We're sometimes looking a few months afterwards. And even if this is a whole gigantic placebo, and I'm saying this as a person, not as a regulator, even if this is a gigantic placebo, if I can change and improve someone's life with one treatment for 3 months, for 6 months at a time, wouldn't that be meaningful and significant for people, right? So that, of course, that's the person as a regulator. As a regulator, I would like to know what happens with the relapse rates, right? How do, what we talk about retreatment and all those things. So those things also need to be answered. So right now, I think I mentioned a little bit about that in my presentation, is that we've been looking at this single episodes and so on, but these are lifelong conditions many times. These are episodic and relapsing and so on. So we also need to look into that. How does that help over long periods of time? Anyway, I hope that answers some of the questions.
Yeah, it would be good to understand if, like what Michael suggests, if there was an endpoint that may be different than the primary endpoint that was done in order to establish acute efficacy, could be actually looked at to look at longer term treatment effectiveness, so, it's, and again, some of those lifestyle outcomes that Michael mentioned, that often are captured in HEOR type studies. It makes me remember the treatment effectiveness assessment in opioid use disorder, which is very good at doing that longitudinal assessment with patients. So yeah, I think that would be a very interesting thing. Yes, Javier.
Yeah, if I may. So that's why I think sometimes it's very important, sometimes when the sponsors are coming to ask us about alternative endpoints, or what key secondary things that they would like to maybe have on a label, spend some alpha on that, and things of that, is that, or co-primaries or any of these things, is that that you start looking at things that measure things that are different but supportive of each other, and especially if you do it in a way like what you're describing. Maybe you have something for the acute, but then on a secondary that you could capture some of these other things that would support that initial thing, but over long periods of time. So here, the challenge is to the sponsors to present to us key secondary endpoints or other outcome measures that they would like to be included that are meaningful, but at the same time complementary to that initial endpoint. So just wanted to say that.
This all points up the importance, I think, of something that routinely gets ignored when exciting new pharmaceuticals are introduced, which is the importance of long-term follow-up studies. The companies in general don't have an incentive to conduct them. They're hard to fund with philanthropy or foundation support alone. This is really where federal funding seems to be essential, and once acute efficacy is demonstrated, it would, just speaking as a clinician now, it's a priority to know what's going to happen to my patients if they have psilocybin for their depression. Are they, going to be okay forever, or is this likely to last 3 months or 6 months? And what happens after that? Are they refractory to the experience the second time around, or does it actually continue to help them? These are all very important questions that can only be answered with a longer term set of studies. Javier.
Okay, so another thing I wanted to bring out, again, because sometimes people don't understand what we do and how we do, and we operate in a regulatory framework with a set of laws, and those laws evolve over time, right? So sometimes things that we approved 20 years ago have slowly, those things can become obsolete. And what are the tools we have now are post-marketing commitments and post-marketing requirements, right? So we routinely, when we get a brand new drug for something, that is exactly what Paul was saying, is exactly in our minds. Do the effects wane over time? What do I need to do? So we ask when we approve that, and you can go to FDA, drugs at FDA, and you can look at the approval letters for each drug, where it will tell you exactly what those commitments or requirements are. And commitment is, yes, we agree with the company, you're going to do this and on good faith. But if we think that something is absolutely necessary, then we'll make them into a requirement, right? So, those tools do exist now. And so unfortunately, kind of a lot of these designs are kind of clunky, like randomized withdrawal trials and things like that. But we're very interested in finding out exactly what some of these questions Paul was bringing up.
Thank you. Any other feedback on that question? No? Well, we only have a few minutes left and we have one question left. So this is working out really well. And this was Suresh's last question in his presentation. And it was, are there surrogate biomarkers that could be utilized? And again, this is relating to establishing efficacy for psychedelics. Suresh, did you want to say something about that first?
Just to lead in by saying that there's been a lot of systematic reviews over the years that have shown that subjective, so one of the things we're obviously worried about here is placebo effects and how much is expectancy, placebo response, et cetera, and there's been a lot of studies and meta-analysis showing that subjective outcome measures, such as that we're using in the conditions that we're largely talking about here, like depression or PTSD, that those are much more liable to be affected by expectancy effects as opposed to objective outcome measures. So if we could have more objective outcome measures, such as a surrogate biomarker, then that might be a way or good complementary evidence to our efficacy outcomes. So if we could actually see something changing biologically, that would sort of surely give us more confidence in what we're actually using as an efficacy measure. But we don't actually know what those are, and I guess those are the holy grail of psychiatry at the moment.
Right. Yeah. I think in the past, even though we've shown very objective, like PET data and stuff like that, at the end of the day, I think our approvals were always based on clinical outcome measures. I don't think they haven't been based too much, at least in neuroscience anyway, on PET data, for instance, or, I'm trying to think of other, key biomarker data or a blood test, for instance. So it would be great. I mean, I think it would be fantastic. Any input on that from the panel about potential biomarkers that could be utilized? No? Any hopes, wishes, prayers? So,
Susan, can I ask a question that might be relevant to this? And I think I got this from Suresh. He talked about Sir Austin Bradford Hill's criteria for causation, where he talked about the strength of the association, consistency, temporal sequence, biological gradient, biological rationale, coherence, and experimental evidence. How much of those sort of ideas, rather than a response against a placebo control, might be utilizable for something like a psychedelic in some sort of for demonstration of efficacy or causation in this case, or registration? The Bradford Hill criteria. I'm thinking of things like strength of association and temporal sequence and dosing responses.
It would be nice to think that they could be used more than they currently are. But I guess that would need to be a discussion between sponsors and regulators about exactly what those criteria and metrics should be before things and studies are conducted.
Good question, though, Aidan. I think we're a little premature, perhaps, for that one. I'm cognizant of the time, and I'm also cognizant that I've been told Dr. Volkow has a very tight schedule today. So I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the participants, the speakers, panelists, for for theme 3 today. This has been fun, very interesting discussion and very intriguing. Still have a long way to go. I think we have a lot of things we need to tackle, which is why I said in my summation remarks that I hope that this workshop is only the first of a few to follow. That's for you, Aiden, and the other organizers. Hopefully this can be a regular event, because I think this has been super helpful to get all of these experts together, and I certainly have learned a lot. So I want to thank you. And with that, I would also like to introduce Dr. Nora Volkow, who's now on screen, I can see, who is our director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And just to remind everybody, NIDA was a co-host for this workshop. So with this, I will hand over to Dr. Volkow to give her final remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. It's a pleasure to see you, by the way, and it's a pleasure to see everyone. And I can truly say that this is one of the most remarkable symposiums that I've attended, and with the virtual world, these have proliferated. And I think it is a reflection, of course, of the coordinated efforts of the very, very competent group of scientists, both at NIMH, NIDA, and NIAA, that came together to really select a series of subject themes and presentations. In a strange way, I mean, I feel a level of overwhelmment in terms of all of the things for which there are no answers. But at the same time, I see this as an incredible opportunity to also modify the way that we are doing things. The discussions have been excellent, and I just don't want to be redundant. But some of the issues that come up in terms of leitmotif in my brain is, because it's at the essence, right? What is it that the NIH can do to help accelerate research in this field so that we can truly understand what are the potentials and ultimately the application of interventions that are based on psychedelic drugs? And I'm just going to make these very clearly, because also one of my concerns immediately, while always keeping in our mind the notion about their sustainability, number one, and also very importantly, that we will make them equitable so that not just the ones that can afford these treatments get access to them. From the perspective of what is it that NIH can do to accelerate, there's no two ways around it. We need to have a greater in-depth understanding about the characteristics of the drugs that we call psychedelics. I tend to agree with the discussions that it's also my favorite term, psychedelics, because it connotes that notion of drugs that are basically affecting your perceptions inwards and outwards. Now you can make, of course, an argument that other drugs may do it that are not classically observed with psychedelics. But I think that this is an essence of these drugs. I do believe that we're going to need to have actually a more granular classification of this type of psychedelics that should not only be based on what their pharmacological targets are, but these should be included in them. And why do I say this? Because even if we speak about the limited drugs that we're currently, for which we have most data, whether it is ketamine or whether it is PCP or NMDA, we know that they differ in terms of the relative impact that the 5-HT2 agonist effects has for their actions versus their effect as NMDA receptor antagonists. And they also, for example, differ very much in terms of their ability to rise dopamine and how they rise dopamine. And yet the latter effect is very relevant because it can, in a way, modulate the extent to which these drugs can produce compulsive drug administration or not. Which, of course, then if they do, like is the case in terms of ketamine, which is misused in several countries across the world and in some areas in Africa is a favored drug, that we need to have actually oversight about what we expect from these drugs. At the same time, I do recognize the concern that we just don't limit the description of these drugs, psychedelic drugs on their pharmacological target, but we need to go beyond that and understand the downstream effects, the functional consequences. And this was very elegantly presented yesterday with a distinction that we have to understand that is distinct when sort of the acute effect versus the subsequent domino type effect that those changes produce. And in my brain, and this is actually crucial on the way that we should be looking at these treatments, because at the end of the day, the way that our brain predicts experience or molds our emotions relate very much in terms of what is it that we are expecting. And if a drug that you can give can profoundly affect that in a way that is very, very effective, then it shouldn't be per se surprising that its effects are going to be consolidated as you navigate your everyday life. And because we haven't been thinking per se like that in terms of neurobiology, I think that this is a good opportunity and moment that the psychedelics drugs offer us to start to question how would we evaluate this. And this is very relevant too in terms also of the notion of the effects being dependent on the context at which they are administered. And overall, as we learn more and more how the brain works, we are aware that the effects of a drug are not just its pharmacological effects, but the interaction on the neural systems that these drugs are acting. And because the brain is out there to respond to our environments, those neural circuits are going to be very different depending on where you are and who you are, which again brings another issue that has been brought up throughout all of these discussions. Because even though the field has been going on for several decades, the number of studies have been relatively limited, and so have been the number of participants enrolled in those studies. It is clear even from this relatively small number of participants that have been in studies that there is significant variability in the responses to these psychotherapeutic drugs and psychedelic drugs. And that understanding that is going to be fundamental in order to basically optimize and ideally tailor the interventions. And I guess in terms of the discussions, just the moment that you start a tailored intervention, then it can become more complex. Yet at the same time, if we don't consider the notion of a tailored intervention, by bringing together and cluster individuals without an understanding of their characteristics, can lead to negative outcomes. So there is both that there are challenges, but there is also an opportunity to ensure that by understanding better what you want to achieve and the characteristics of the individuals that you are including, you may be more likely to see an effect. And then you can determine if it is generalizable or not. As we go along with these clinical trials, of course, this is top in my brain too, and it was many of you discuss it. We need to also be very sensitive to the potential of negative outcomes and negative effects. And these negative outcomes and effects can be at the individual level, but it also, we have to be mindful of the potential effects at the population level. At the individual level, it was noted in one of the presentations yesterday, for example, that some of these drugs may have cardiotoxic effects. Where the cardiotoxicity, again, may be only limited to individuals with certain risk or certain molecules. And again, highlighting why it becomes so very important to understand the parameters that are necessary in terms of molecular targets. At the population level, I do think that we also have a responsibility. Because one of the things that was very remarkable, and I'm always looking at a lot of numbers in terms of what are people taking drugs, what type of people are taking drugs and why. And among young people, 18 to 22 is where you see the highest level of drug use in general, certainly in the United States, 18 to 24. And in these last numbers that we got at the end of last year, what surprised me was the significant rise in hallucinogenic use by young people. And these were individuals that were done through 18 to 22. And it was one of the largest increases that I've seen in 1 year. I mean, albeit, yes, it is the COVID pandemic, and this may be a way that people are using to try to escape it. But as has been mentioned by many already, let's learn from history. Let's see what we have learned from the marijuana experience. the medicalization of marijuana by the states and its approval, one of the consequences that it has created on is the belief, number one, that if it has medicinal purposes, it cannot be so harmful. And so we have seen a significant increase in the use of cannabis for recreational purposes as well as for medical purposes. And this is likely to happen as more and more attention is placed on these psychedelic drugs. And I think that the last numbers that I am referring to in part reflect this issue. So how do we actually, at the same time, navigate the other aspect that has been very challenging with cannabis? And that is, as the states themselves create policies that make the access of these drugs for medical purposes more widely available, people are going to start to use it, whether FDA approves or not. And we are going to have to be careful that this actually does not have negative intended consequences. But at the same time, this, to me, the notion that, I think to a certain extent, with all of the attention that the psychedelic drugs have attracted, that the train has left the station and that people are going to start to use it and are going to be vulnerable to places that offer this treatment without quality control or safety for these individuals, which to me highlights the responsibility that we have, certainly as researchers and the NIH as an agency, to ensure that we do the research that can inform people about what are the requirements for these treatments, where they could have beneficial, where they could be have adverse effects, so that they are knowledgeable about it. At the same time, it's very clear that, because we are just at the inception and the possibilities of what these psychedelics are being used is going to just be expanding, and we will see it. We are going to need to prioritize what are some of the most crucial questions that we need to address. As I think about what it also opens to us, for me, it's fascinating scientifically. And I think that what was a turning point in my brain clearly was the fact that esketamine was approved by the FDA. And the notion that we could have a drug that is considered a psychedelic drug approved for a treatment of a psychiatric disorder, and moreover, that in some patients, the effect sizes from these drugs are quite large. And similarly, some of the pilot data that was presented for PTSD, and even in terms of the pilot data that was presented for smoking cessation, clearly indicates that we cannot ignore those signals. They may not be sufficient to say this is effective, but they are sufficient to say we cannot ignore them. And the concept that the FDA can actually create a path forward for their approval makes it even much more likely that then they are translated into the clinic and treatment, and they are reimbursed. And I think that that's where we all need to work across agencies and in listening to the needs of the FDA and the requirements. At the same time, the pressure from the investigators and sometimes the need to innovate. And I think that, yes, we've seen this with the COVID pandemic, where we have been forced to actually accelerate the development and the approval of treatments because of the urgency of the situation. One can make the argument that actually there is an urgency to bring treatments for people that are suffering from severe mental illness, which can be devastating. And to what extent the risk benefits, how do we look at them in a way that is as safe as possible, but can at the same time accelerate the process of discovery and translation. There are multiple points that were discussed. And again, I don't want to actually go through them because they were very much gone in depth. But I want to actually end just my point that as we move forward, I think that is from the perspective of science and for the perspective of psychiatry is extraordinarily fascinating, because we're opening the doors to not just one intervention, but the notion that you are giving an intervention that is going to directly enhance another one. And we spoke a lot about psychotherapeutics, but we, of course, and psychotherapy with psychedelics, but we can also think about it in terms of neuromodulation. And again, why it becomes so very important to understand the effects of these drugs so that we can maximize how to combine them together. And the notion that also was discussed, this is one that we have been too very much interested in working with the FDA about, is changing the outcomes in order to get an indication. So changing it from an indication that is just depression or is just, say, opioid addiction, to an indication that, for example, may relate much more to self-regulation or to emotional control, for example, that could go across transdiagnostics and could, on the one hand, in some instances, open up the number of patients that will benefit from those therapeutics. In the case of drug addiction, where classically the outcome is abstinence, which is very difficult to achieve, one could see how alternative outcomes could be much easier to achieve and yet very beneficial to the patients. And in that line, the last statement that I want us to think about is that as we work forward with the development and testing of psychedelic drugs, we need to bring the patients into the discussions so that the priorities and their concerns are actually incorporated into our research plans. I think in the same line, we need to basically very clearly understand too where we are in history and what we've learned from the past so that we do not commit the same mistakes and errors. And therefore the importance of ensuring that there is an ethic oversight on what we do and that everything that we do is under the understanding that it will be equitable. And with that, I want to thank everyone very much for your attention. And I look forward for the next installment. This was really remarkable. Congratulations to everyone.
And with that, I would like to thank Nora for her closing comments and thank everyone for joining. And I think we now can close the meeting. Thank you, everybody. It's been fantastic.
I agree, Ada. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.